Good morning, church. I've mentioned this in a previous devotional, but I want to revisit it. J.R.R. Tolkien, in The Return of the King, which is the third book of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, his story culminates with the great battle at the Black Gate and the ring being destroyed. At this point, evil has been defeated in Middle-earth, and many would say that this is a great place to end the book. However, Tolkien, he gives us more info. He makes a point of telling us that Aragorn is crowned the High King. He then tells us that the elves, Gandalf, Bilbo, and Frodo leave for the Grey Havens, and thus begins the Age of Men. In other words, we see the fruit of evil being defeated. Mark's gospel is both similar and different from this kind of ending. It's similar in that we see the defeat of evil. That is, we see Christ on the cross taking the sins of man. And then we see the assurance of that victory in the resurrection. However, the book ends rather abruptly. Here's how it goes. When they, that is the women, entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe sitting on the right side. The women were shocked, but the angel said, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body. Now go and tell his disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you before he died." The women fled the tomb, trembling and bewildered, and they said nothing to anyone because they were too frightened. This is an abrupt and rather strange ending to the Gospel of Mark. And there's three possible explanations for this abrupt ending. The first one is that the full ending has been lost. Perhaps, for whatever reason, in the providence of God, the Holy Spirit chose not to give us the original ending. The second option is there are two alternate endings that you do find in some ancient manuscripts, and perhaps these are actually the real ending, even though the earliest copies of Mark don't include it. The third option is that the ending is simply abrupt. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in this field, but I believe that the third explanation works best for two reasons. One, the earliest and most reliable texts seem to have this abrupt ending. Mark, and more importantly, the Holy Spirit, has no obligation to give us a nice, neat ending that we would like. Number two, Mark starts his book this way, and this is in the first verse of the Gospel of Mark. This is the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ. For Mark, it seems that this account is not a single volume story, but the first chapter in what Christ is planning to do. The quick ending functions as an invitation to be a part of the story. Christ is risen. Now what will you do? If Christ has been truly raised, then that changes everything, and we must respond. So how is the story continued? Here's a few ways. We see the story continue in the transformation of the disciples, going from despair to hope, from being people who often misunderstood Jesus to knowing and sharing the truth. They went from cowards to missionaries, evangelists, and church leaders. We see the story continue in the early church, growing from a few to many, and from a small sect to a real movement. We see the story continue throughout church history, growing to the largest religion in the world, and being an institution responsible for thousands of local churches, charities, hospitals, and schools. We see the story continue in our own lives, moving from death to life, from being the old self to a new creation, and from eternal punishment to eternal glory. The story of Jesus continues today because we are adopted sons and daughters of God, and we are brothers and sisters with Christ. We as the church have been called to continue the work of God. When you have the thought that you wish you could have lived in the time when Christ walked the earth, which I sometimes do, I think we need to remember this. We're filled with the Spirit to continue the work of God in all areas of life today. I'll be praying for you. Please pray for me, and I'll see you next week.